50 days into this conflict, the international community remains fixated on a singular, increasingly irrelevant question: will the 2-week ceasefire be officially extended? While headlines obsess over tomorrow's deadline, focusing on this temporary pause is akin to watching the second hand of a clock, while entirely ignoring the changing of the seasons. The fundamental architecture of this geopolitical confrontation has already undergone a massive, irreversible structural shift. To understand the true trajectory of the global order, one must look past the immediate tactical delays and recognize why the official extension of a ceasefire is no longer the defining metric of this crisis. When the initial strikes commenced 50 days ago, the overarching fear was the ignition of an uncontrollable, region-wide conflagration, a scenario that could easily drag global superpowers into an indefinite, boundless war. At that genesis point, a ceasefire meant everything. It was the fragile concrete barrier separating manageable conflict from absolute catastrophe. Today, however, the fog of war has lifted enough to reveal a stark, pragmatic reality. This conflict will not devolve into an endless, Vietnam-style quagmire, simply because neither the United States nor Iran possesses the strategic will or the material capacity to sustain an infinite war of attrition. The economic and political mathematics simply do not support total war. The United States is currently navigating the intense gravitational pull of upcoming domestic elections, where the political cost of sustained high oil prices could prove fatal for any incumbent administration. Deploying and maintaining extensive naval strike groups in the region burns through tens of millions of dollars daily, draining resources while alienating key diplomatic allies who are desperate for market stability. Conversely, Iran is confronting a severely degraded military infrastructure following recent targeted strikes. Its domestic economy, already throttled by prolonged isolation, is visibly contracting, and critical energy facilities require immediate, capital-intensive reconstruction. Historically, when heavy military forces collide with unyielding macroeconomic realities, maximalist ambitions evaporate. We are witnessing the definitive elimination of extreme outcomes. The scenario of a complete Iranian collapse and absolute American victory has been thoroughly discarded. Foreign military strikes alone almost never trigger systemic regime collapse, a historical constant proven time and time again across various continents. Similarly, the prospect of a sudden American retreat, leaving critical maritime choke points indefinitely blockaded and conceding total victory to Tehran, is equally impossible given the strategic imperatives of global supply chains. The geopolitical landscape is no longer a raging wildfire waiting for a sudden gust of wind. Rather, it has become a slow-moving hydraulic press, where overwhelming economic and structural realities are systematically crushing the absolute ambitions of both sides into a shape resembling forced compromise. In the grand calculus of international power, tactical pauses merely delay the inevitable reckoning. It is the silent, mutual exhaustion of resources that ultimately dictates the boundaries of peace. Indeed, as these boundaries take shape, the true center of gravity in this conflict has shifted away from the battlefields and into the highly classified negotiating rooms. The definitive variable determining whether this geopolitical tremor stabilizes is the substantive framework surrounding nuclear capabilities. Behind the closed doors of the Islamabad process, the global chessboard has been carefully set with three distinct, fiercely debated scenarios. The first framework introduces a 10-year freeze on uranium enrichment, with the United States purportedly offering to financially underwrite and supply the necessary nuclear fuel. While Iranian leadership predictably dismissed this initial overture, its mere existence is a profound diplomatic revelation. It signals a critical acknowledgement by American negotiators that a permanent, total prohibition on enrichment is an unattainable fantasy. Diplomatic public postures often function as the aggressive opening bids in a high-stakes auction. The uncompromising public stance creates leverage, while the private, time-limited offer reveals the true zone of possible agreement. Interestingly, Russia has simultaneously floated a parallel technical solution, offering to absorb and neutralize existing stockpiles of highly enriched uranium. This logistical lifeline, mirroring complex discussions from over a decade ago, demonstrates a serious pursuit of actionable technical off-ramps rather than mere political posturing. The second, and far more geopolitically viable, scenario is a reimagined, significantly tighter iteration of the Historical Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. The underlying logic of that 2015 architecture was limited capacity. It mandated a drastic, verifiable reduction in active nuclear infrastructure, forcing a contraction from approximately 19,000 centrifuges down to a strictly monitored 5,060. It kept enrichment purity at a heavily regulated 3.67%, requiring the physical dilution or foreign export of any materials exceeding the 20% threshold. This framework brilliantly utilized the concept of creative ambiguity, allowing both capitals to claim a domestic political victory. Washington could assure its allies that the breakout time for weaponization had been extended from a few precarious months to over a year. Simultaneously, Tehran maintained its sovereign right to domestic enrichment, albeit under an extreme straitjacket of daily inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA. However, any newly resurrected framework will invariably demand a much tighter leash, significantly fewer operational centrifuges, lower purity ceilings, and highly intrusive, unprecedented verification protocols to satisfy modern political realities. The third scenario represents the maximalist illusion: absolute zero enrichment. This remains the loud, public political baseline for hawkish factions, demanding a total and permanent dismantling of all nuclear infrastructure. Yet, modern history offers a chilling and definitive verdict on the demand for absolute sovereign surrender. When faced with an uncompromising ultimatum of zero enrichment, Pyongyang chose absolute isolation and rapid weaponization. Baghdad's nuclear ambitions were severely crippled by preemptive foreign military strikes in 1981, and further decimated a decade later in 1991. Yet compliance was ultimately forced through sheer destruction, not diplomatic consensus. No sovereign nation has ever voluntarily signed an agreement demanding the total eradication of its nuclear capability. Zero enrichment is an impossible terminus, but it serves brilliantly as an anchoring cognitive bias in negotiations, providing negotiators the optical space to make inevitable concessions later, while convincing their domestic base they held the line. Global diplomacy is rarely a heavy broadsword that cleanly severs a problem. Rather, it is a complex, delicate alchemy that transmutes absolute demands into tolerable realities. Ultimately, the pinnacle of modern statecraft lies not in achieving total victory, but in carefully engineering an unstable equilibrium that both adversaries can domesticate and parade as a triumph. Yet, while the world fixates on the theoretical limits of nuclear enrichment, the practical mechanics of how these agreements are actually forged are actively unfolding in the shadows. Why, for instance, did Pakistan's Chief of Army Staff, General Asim Munir, suddenly arrive in Tehran this morning, rather than a traditional diplomat or a highly visible foreign minister? He carries fresh, highly sensitive directives originating directly from Washington. This is not a mere ceremonial courtesy call. It is a meticulously calculated deployment of shadow diplomacy. In the architecture of global conflict resolution, one must understand the distinct dichotomy between civilian diplomacy and military realism. During severe geopolitical crises, traditional foreign ministries often become completely paralyzed by rigid bureaucratic protocols, intense international media scrutiny, and the inescapable need for domestic political grandstanding. Military-to-military communication channels, however, operate on an entirely different, highly pragmatic frequency. They are blunt, results-oriented, and heavily shielded from the immediate, volatile demands of public opinion. When generals speak to generals, the conversation strips away the burdensome ideological rhetoric. They do not debate morality. They focus purely on tangible military assets, non-negotiable red lines, and immediate physical security imperatives. Pakistan, possessing a formidable military apparatus and a unique geopolitical standing as a nuclear-armed Islamic republic, serves as the perfect insulated conduit for this level of high stakes, uncompromising communication. General Munir has already proven his critical efficacy in this shadowy domain. During the absolute peak tension of the initial military strikes, he served as the indispensable intermediary, shuttling vital, time-sensitive communications between rival global powers when official embassies had essentially gone dark. His presence in the Iranian capital today is designed to objectively assess the precise atmospheric conditions for a second round of intensive negotiations. He is there to meticulously probe the core leadership, to determine what specific technical and economic conditions are fundamentally required to restart a productive, binding dialogue. Furthermore, it is highly revealing that seasoned diplomatic circles are no longer referring to these engagements as isolated, frantic meetings. They are actively branding this the Islamabad process. The deliberate introduction of the word process represents a massive psychological and strategic shift. It implies the creation of a durable, institutionalized diplomatic framework designed specifically to withstand temporary, inevitable failures. It ensures that if one specific round of dialogue collapses under pressure, the underlying communication architecture remains intact, preventing the adversaries from automatically defaulting back to catastrophic ballistic missile exchanges. High-level diplomacy is rarely conducted in the sterile, unforgiving light of official press conferences. It is forged in the quiet, pragmatic corridors of military realism. Just as a heavy iron anchor secures a massive vessel against the violent, unpredictable currents of a midnight storm, these discrete military backchannels provide the unseen absolute stabilization necessary to prevent the global order from drifting aimlessly into total war. Furthermore, while military strategists calculate centrifuge capacities, the global financial markets are rapidly pricing in a completely different set of mathematics. If a stable diplomatic framework is solidified, and the Strait of Hormuz is permanently reopened for commercial transit, the geopolitical risk premium that has suffocated global equities will evaporate. We are looking at a potential macroeconomic earthquake that will send a $1 trillion ripple effect directly through Asian markets, specifically impacting manufacturing hubs like Taiwan and financial centers like Hong Kong. Consider the fundamental calculus of energy costs. Should global maritime supply chains return to normal operations, the price of WTI crude oil could systematically decompress from its current elevated peak of around $92 per barrel, stabilizing back into the $75 to $80 range. For highly industrialized, export-driven economies heavily reliant on imported fuel, this is an immediate, massive injection of capital. Taiwan, for instance, could see its annual energy import expenditures plummet by over $10 billion. This drastic reduction in overhead directly translates into expanded profit margins and heightened global export competitiveness. At the epicenter of this industrial web sits TSMC, the undisputed anchor of the global semiconductor supply chain. The fabrication of microscopic, cutting-edge silicon wafers is a process of extreme, unimaginable precision that demands absolutely colossal, uninterrupted streams of electricity. Over the past 50 days, the soaring cost of imported natural gas and coal has quietly forced industrial electricity rates significantly higher across the island. A decompression in global energy markets will materially improve the operational balance sheets of TSMC and its sprawling network of downstream suppliers. Under these specific conditions, regional capital indexes could experience a sustained structural expansion of 10 to 15% over the coming months. Furthermore, we must examine the broader, slow-moving glacier of global inflation. The sharp spike in energy prices was the deepest and most enduring economic scar inflicted by this. If energy futures contract, long-term inflation expectations will immediately cool. This provides central banks, primarily the United States Federal Reserve, with the critical macroeconomic bandwidth required to reconsider aggressive interest rate cuts. A dovish shift in global monetary policy acts as pure financial oxygen for technology and growth equities. The semiconductor foundries of Taiwan and the highly leveraged financial institutions of Hong Kong stand to be the primary beneficiaries of this liquidity injection. However, market mechanics operate on anticipation, not current reality. While the physical price of gasoline at the local consumer pump may take several painful months to reflect these diplomatic breakthroughs, institutional capital moves at the speed of light. International capital is much like a massive reservoir of water held back by the heavy concrete dam of geopolitical risk. The moment diplomatic pressure cracks that dam, the liquidity floods instantly into high-yield Asian assets. Waiting to feel the economic relief in your daily expenses means you have already completely missed the institutional market reaction, rather than waiting for delayed consumer metrics. As we navigate these crucial upcoming weeks, the true indicators of geopolitical progress will not be broadcast in official, highly sanitized press releases. Instead, they will emerge as subtle, almost imperceptible tremors on the diplomatic seismograph. How do we accurately decipher these signals before the broader market reacts? The first and most immediate metric is observing precisely which level of the diplomatic hierarchy officially receives the Pakistani general. If he is welcomed merely by mid-level bureaucratic officials within the foreign ministry, it is a clear indicator that the central leadership in Tehran is still stalling, calculating their domestic leverage before committing to the table. Conversely, if he secures an audience with direct advisors to the highest echelons of leadership, or the foreign minister himself, it is an undeniable flashing green light that the appetite for a second, substantive round of the Islamabad process is genuine. The second signal lies in the silence surrounding the ceasefire deadline. Do not expect a triumphant joint declaration of an extension. The most probable and politically astute outcome is an implicit, unannounced continuation. By simply maintaining the pause without formalizing it, both Washington and Tehran brilliantly avoid the domestic political optics of concession. The United States does not have to publicly admit it granted its geopolitical competitor time to regroup, and Iran avoids conceding that it yielded to American pressure. They simply maintain the quiet. However, the ultimate that this conflict is genuinely concluded when anonymous sources begin leaking specific centrifuge counts, exact enrichment purity ceilings, and the precise frequency schedules of international nuclear inspections. The architecture of peace is actively being built. This transition from debating the broad philosophical principles of war to negotiating the tedious mathematical minutiae of nuclear physics is the exact moment when political posturing transforms into binding statecraft. We are 50 days into a conflict that has finally recognized its own destiny. In ancient Eastern philosophy, reaching the age of 50 is synonymous with understanding the mandate of heaven, the realization of one's ultimate fate. This war has discovered its fate. It will not end in the glorious, total annihilation of a competitor, but in a heavily calculated, profoundly compromised equilibrium over uranium. The trajectory is undeniably set, and the global financial mechanisms are already turning in anticipation. The most profound shifts in global power are never announced with trumpets. They are negotiated in whispers. I will continue to monitor these diplomatic shadows and translate the complexities of this evolving world order. Share your perspective on this shifting geopolitical paradigm in the comments below, and subscribe to navigate these unseen currents together.